Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be the Torah, inspired or given at Mount Sinai. So this stems from a claim that I've heard made, specifically within certain movements, with certain Jewish movements. And it's this idea that the claim is, of a God-inspired Torah, but definitely not given by God, if you will. And I say that in kind of a, flippant way because that's almost the way that the statement is made. And what it basically boils down to is someone saying the Torah was written by Jews, plural, and was inspired by God, but it was not given at Mount Sinai. So this brings up a couple questions whenever I've interacted with this, and I've found that when I bring this up to people, not in like an argumentative style, but just to kind of ask people a couple questions about it, they either seem to not want to answer it or they want to get really combative about it. And what I mean is the following. Well, here's a couple of questions towards a statement like this. Well, where does your evidence for a God even come from? I mean, what proof do you have that there's a God to begin with? I mean, because someone could look at reality and say there's no God just as much as someone could say that there is God. So it would make more sense that a God would have to like reveal itself somehow for someone to even know it exists. Otherwise, you could just simply say, okay, the world is what it is, or even the world is just as big as I see it visually to be. There's no need to think that there's anything beyond the world until someone finds it. But a person could even say, well, humans created this idea of a God, you know, and and that there is no such thing. But it depends also, but what is the definition of a God to even begin with? So the next question would be, where does your evidence for this God inspiring the writing of the Torah even come from? Meaning, if I'm going to say that God inspired a text, well, there had to be some way for me to identify the inspiration, because, for example, did God inspire everything? Like, for example, did God inspire like Shakespeare? I mean, most people would say no. God didn't inspire Shakespeare to write what he wrote. But how do we know that exactly? How would we know that God inspired something versus not inspiring something? Because then everything could be inspired by God, if you will, but it depends on what it means. So one person can say inspire means that the people who wrote it, you know, had this belief in a God already, which the question still begs, well, where did they get it from? And then, they decided to write a Torah based upon, this inspiration. Or a person can say, well, God kind of was behind the scenes, secretly kind of putting two and two together and getting them to write certain things, and then voila, here's the Torah. But then we're going to see pretty soon that there's things written in the Torah that don't make sense if God did it that way, right? Rather than just simply tell people to write what actually did happen, rather than what didn't happen. So the next thing is, if God has the ability to inspire the writing of the Torah, why did he allow the authors to claim he gave the Torah at Mount Sinai? And we'll explain what that means in just a little bit also. And then lastly, if God has the ability to create a universe, why inspire people to write down things that didn't happen historically? Wouldn't direct revelation be easier? And I'll explain what that means in just a second also. So then let's look at what makes more sense. And this doesn't mean that, I'm saying, okay, if a person has questions or doesn't see proof of something, like ignore that and just believe the Torah was given by Hashem. I'm talking about something completely different in terms of the issue of inspiration, almost as a way to say, well, cool, my view makes more sense for me to hold some of this belief, but then to get rid of the stuff I don't want to do. So let's look at the following. When I talked about, okay, you have a being that people call an English God, creates a universe, but doesn't have the ability to give a Torah. How much sense does that make? Because which is harder to do? Obviously, it'd be harder to create a universe rather than simply like find a group of people, bring them out of whatever circumstance they're in, take them to a place, say, okay, here, I'm the creator of all things. This is what I need you to do. And I want you to do it for these reasons. If you do it the right way, this is the way we go. If you do it the wrong way, then there's consequences that open up because of how I created reality. How hard does that seem compared to like creating a universe? So that's why I say it doesn't make any sense if someone that says, well, no, 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 he didn't give a Torah, but he, inspired a Torah. Because it's like, well, why is it so hard to give a Torah? I mean, is it impossible? And if it's not impossible, we'll look in the Torah in just a second to see what it says. It would make more sense to inspire something else. If it's just an inspiration thing, because people, if it's just a matter of, okay, write whatever you want, and I'll just kind of like let you do whatever, and I'll just watch over you until you write something I don't like, or I'll let you lie about things, and it doesn't really matter. As long as you write something that fits for you and it builds a mythology, it doesn't really matter. I mean, these are the questions you'd have to ask. So let's look at the side of it of Jews who say that the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. You see me use this map before. And every single ancient Jewish community, this is the oral tradition they have about the written text, meaning that the oral tradition precedes the written text. The written text is almost like what I always tell people like Cliff Notes. But the oral, tradition or the oral transmission says that all of these groups, even though they were spread throughout the Jewish world, claim to have a singularity of the Torah being given at Mount Sinai by the creator of all things. And if we all agree that there is such a thing as a creator of all things, it isn't impossible for a creator of all things to do such a thing, to gather a group of people, give them, if you will, 40 years of interaction. And then at the end of that, say, okay, I want, the leader of you guys, before he passes away, to write a text, and I want it written exactly like this. And it's like the short version of everything else that I'm giving, but there's an oral tradition around it. The only thing that verifies this text here is not because people say, well, the creator wrote it, because the creator obviously, even according to Torah-based Jews, didn't write the Torah. The Torah was dictated to Moshe ben Amram, which in English you know him as Moses, and then he wrote what was shown to him and dictated to him. So the text, for example, the creator of all things already knew what the creator wanted to be in the text, and it's basically the same text, with very little difference between Jewish communities that were exiled in different directions for, for quite a bit of time. So let's consider something that's written in the Torah. If you look in the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim 4:35, it mentions the following: Ata horetho lada'at ki Adonai hu Elohim ein od milvado. Translation and explanation of this is that the Bnei Yisrael, which is actually how you pronounce the people of Israel in Hebrew, were given the national revelation at Mount Sinai in order to know that Hashem is the Elohim, is the source of reality, the power behind everything, and the source of things that have power in the universe, if you will. There is no other with, beside, or in conjunction with him. So this is a statement that's made in the Torah concerning, what exactly, was supposed to be happening here. So then next, we can see that the Torah says, Panim bepanim, diber Adonai, imachem bahar metocha ish, onochi amad ben Adonai uvanechem, be'ef just just one second. Sorry, always get phone calls when I try to do videos. Um, And it continues, it says, בעת ההוא, להגיד לכם את דבר אדוני, כי יריתם מפני האש ולא עליתם בהר לאמור. So, translation explanation. The Bnei Israel as a nation were interacting with the source of creation and witnessed it for themselves, meaning that the creator of all things created a situation where the people of Israel, were able to, hear and also, if you will, see the words of the creator of all things. And this is by way of what's called nevuah in the Jewish language. But that essentially because of fear of being overwhelmed by this whole thing, as a national thing, basically people said, okay, Moshe Rabbeinu, you go up there and talk to Hashem. Everything Hashem tells you, we'll do. And one of the explanations is that when the creator of all things spoke to the Israeli people, it was done in a way to where it wasn't just a matter of saying words, because the word creator of all things doesn't have a mouth, of course, but it's a matter of elevating the people of Israel to where every element of our senses, including those that we don't, use in this world, were elevated to the point where it was clear that this is the source of creation, and there is no other before and after, and there's no other with the creator of all things. So this is like someone, trying the creator of all things, making it clear. I want to make it clear to you what the reality is, so that this, experience will last throughout every generation, even if there are some who will say that, they don't believe it happened, that there'll be enough of you that knows it did happen because it's something that several generations experience, and it's something that a person can look back and say, my father, my grandfather, and my uncle, my cousin, my sister, my brother, my uncles and, aunts, and everybody in the family experienced this, and not just mine, his, hers, his, hers, his, hers. And even through exile, you have Jews saying, hey, I was exiled to like Yemen, but we have the same claim as the people who were exiled to Libya. And I've never met the guy from Libya. We haven't had a contact in more than 2,500 years. So consider the following, and this is what I mentioned earlier. A being that can create a universe, but can't give a text. So this is some of the problems with the claim of the inspiration claim, and this is why I said people there's I think that the claim kind of comes from trying to have both worlds at the same time, of saying I want to reject the Torah, but I also want to kind of keep it because it allows me to be able to say certain things about myself because of it. Well, the first question I would say is, okay, historically speaking, not religion or faith, historically speaking, who compiled the first Torah text? What was the guy's name? And what year did he do it? Because if you're going to say that you know that there's a God and you know that God inspired it but didn't give it, then you should also be able to tell me who compiled the first text. What was the guy's name? And who convinced everyone to accept it? How did he get the Jews of Yemen to accept it? The Jews of North Africa and Southern Europe to accept it? How did he get Mizrahi Jews in Syria, Iraq, and other parts of Yemen to accept it? How did he get Ashkenazi Jews to accept it? How did he do all of that in exile? Because one of the things that, has to be clear here is that this person would have had to have convinced people that their ancestors experienced something that they didn't experience. And he'd also have to do it to a group of people who are known to be very debatable and argumentative, meaning that within the Yemenite Jewish community, there were huge debates and arguments where groups who agreed that there was the Torah, agreed with Jewish law, but then debated some other issue to the point where it was like a heated debate. And it's part of the culture, if you will, to say, okay, well, I'm going to investigate every little inch of what you're saying to make sure it's true or not. And I'll give a good example. I used to pray at a synagogue sometimes. There was a Chabad synagogue, and the rabbi there would give like a what's called in Hebrew a shiur, or like a lesson. He would teach something from the Torah. And then what would happen is, as soon as he finished, he would say, "Does anybody have questions?" And there was one guy that was sitting next to him that every single shiur, every single lesson, the guy would immediately start with, "Rabbi, you said this, but I don't agree with anything you said." And he would go into him, and they would like have a debate like the whole time, every single week. Now, but it was like a relationship of, okay, what's your source for that? And I'm going to go back and check to see whether what you said was true or not. I'm not going to just accept it because you said it. And that happens in synagogues and in Jewish communities a lot for thousands of years because you have a situation where this isn't just a Torah that only one guy can read or a group of people can read. Everybody in the Jewish community is being taught to like learn the Torah so we can read it. So everybody's a part of the argument. So to believe that somehow some guy was able to compile a text, convince everybody to take that one text, and then maintain it for 2,500 years of like reading it, copying it, debating it, and even people who are considered to be the least amongst the people being able to read it and debate it and argue it. That's kind of hard to come by in the Jewish community. Someone would have said, look, the text you compiled, that didn't happen to my father. Maybe the Jews of Yemen would have said that. Because one of the things that did happen a number of generations ago, there was a rabbi, I think from Syria, who traveled to Yemen about, I would say, a little bit over 100 years ago. And he wrote about how he like saw that their Torah text had a few minor differences between what he was used to. So he took some copies of their text, went back to where I think he went to Europe or something at one point, and he started correcting the text. But then he found some text from his community and in Europe that matched what the Jews of Yemen had. And it was just that over time, somehow they lost certain elements of their tradition in that part of Europe he was in. And he wrote how he felt bad that he started changing the text, thinking that they were wrong, when really they had the same thing that anciently in his community they had also. But nobody in Yemen was willing to accept his changes, and he was also looking like, okay, well, you guys are wrong. So to have 2,500 years where there's only about 14 differences in their minor, and then to have no one, to have this idea that nobody challenged us to say, my grandfather never told me about this, that doesn't make any sense because if that's the case, then Jews would jump on board on every little thing. And most Jews, in some cases, don't. You have to have a lot of proof before someone's willing to do something. And in most cases, most Jews aren't willing to give up their own traditions unless you get to their kids and like basically wean their kids out of it. But that's the thing that, is one of the problems with this whole inspired idea. And then, looking at it from this angle, on the right side here, you've got a Libyan Jewish Torah, from Libya, and on the left side you have a Yemenite one, and these are like ones that are pretty old. I think this one's like a couple hundred years old if I remember correctly, and this might also be the same. Who convinced them to write in the same exact manner here? Why didn't someone say, "Well, I don't have to write this way. I'm going to just write it as a straight line. I don't need to have gaps here. What do I have gaps here?" Or someone saying, "Look, my tradition doesn't have gaps between all this stuff." Who got them to do that? Especially when you look at the distance between Libya and Yemen. And some of the Jews in Libya were living in caves at one point and cut themselves off also from the other Libyan Jews. It was only through, exploration that some people found them in those caves before the state of Israel. And the same thing, you have Iraq, there's huge Jewish communities in Iraq. Who convinced everybody at these distances to accept texts that are virtually the same? This is a problem with this claim of the inspiration part of it. So then it goes back to what I said before, putting faces on things. You have Jews here from different parts of the world. You have Jews from different parts of the Middle East, Jews from Ethiopia, Jews from different parts of Europe. You know, any one of the people here would have looked and said, okay, look, my father, was rabbi such and such. I come from a long line of rabbis. The information you're trying to say did not come from him. And the one thing you can, and some of the several things you can find amongst all these communities, every single one of them have, traditions going back through their ancestry, going back generations, and every single one of them claims that their ancestors received the Torah at Mount Sinai, and that it was not through inspiration, like, someone was saying on the other side of it, and that it was through direct intervention that the creator of all things, who created the universe and obviously has the power to do it, gave the Torah to the people of Israel, and that at the end of the day, before Moshe Rabbeinu died, he, was basically tasked by the creator by dictation of writing the text that, has been passed down. Now again, it's in human hands at that point. meaning that there are Jews who sat down and created rules for how to transmit the Torah, and these rules predate more than 2,500 years. And through 2,500 years, you can take whether it be the Dead Sea Scrolls or Torah scrolls from Yemen, from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, and find that they're basically virtually the same text, that they say the same thing. Where you'd expect that somebody would change it dramatically because they were exiled in one direction and never met this guy. So this rabbi here would have never met this rabbi here's like parents or grandparents or so on and so on. So, there'd be no reason for him to keep the same text he has and vice versa. This rabbi here would have had no reason in his family to keep the same text as this rabbi here's family. So, in conclusion, the basic issue I've gone back to is that when someone says, okay, well, I believe the Torah was inspired, but I don't believe it was given. And the question would be, well, okay, well, again, what's your evidence for that? If we're going evidence based, I mean, how do you know something inspired something? If, I mean, there's no way of proving that. Just because you say so doesn't mean that that's what happened. Number one. Number two, if that's the case, why did the creator of all things allow people to write in the text that your ancestors experienced this, your ancestors saw this, you saw this for yourself, this happened and you saw it? It would make more sense to me that the creator of all things would say, okay, look, I didn't give anybody a Torah, so I'm not going to let anybody think that I gave them a Torah. I want them to know that I inspired them, but not directly. I never directly. So this text here, all this stuff here needs to be changed. Take that stuff out. That's not what happened. I only want what happened because again, that makes more logical sense. It makes more sense to say, have the text say what happened, because there's a lot of danger in having someone believe these words actually did happen. Because you could have someone like, risk their life thinking that these things that the creator of all things gave a Torah, or this part here that the creator of all things, helped the people of Israel escape Egypt. There's a lot of danger that comes along with it. And because the Torah talks about the land of Israel and that what Jews are supposed to do to get to the land of Israel. Well, what if Jews want to come to the land of Israel and none of this stuff was true? Well, that puts the people of Israel in danger. We shouldn't even be living here if that's the case. But then that's why I say it doesn't make any logical sense. Now, this doesn't mean that someone should throw away the logic and say, "Well, I believe everything the Torah says just because you say so." No, you have to investigate that too if you don't already know. So this is a however from the Chronicles of Ehav, and hopefully I've got every single idea I had about this out. I'll probably have to do an addendum at some point. Thank you. Take care and bye.